Hello everyone and welcome back to YPAC. Today we're going to be talking about the debt limit deal and everything surrounding it. So first of all, if this seems repetitive, that's because it is. The Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen first brought this issue to light in about January, so saying that we have reached our national debt limit of $31.4 trillion and we need to increase our debt limit. Otherwise, we have to go into default. And if you didn't know, the impacts of default are stock prices falling, interest rate rising, the dollar also probably falling, and then in the worst case possible scenario, a recession and even a depression. And that obviously, the US economy is the biggest and most impactful in the world, and so that would really lead to a global collapse of economics. And so it really mattered for the United States to be able to raise or at least suspend the debt limit temporarily for the next couple of years or so, which is what they agreed upon. But this didn't go without compromises on both sides. And that's really what President Biden also put forward in his Oval Office address, that both sides had to make compromises and that this was a really good sign for our democracy. Now, I'll talk more about that later, but firstly, on the actual bill and the backgrounds, not bill, but deal and the backgrounds of that. So, the House voted 314 yeas to 117 nays. The Senate voted 63 yeas to 39 nays, and then one person not voting, 63 to 36, and then one person not voting. And then, obviously, President Biden also signed the bill. First of all, a cap on non-military government spending. I'll explain that more later. It also lifts the pause on federal student loan prepayments, or basically blocks student debt cancellation, which is something that President Biden had worked on and passed a bill on earlier this year, or maybe even last year, but now this has basically rescinded that. Talking about rescinding, the deal also rescinds some IRS funding that Congress had passed last year. So last year, with the Inflation Reduction Act that Democrats passed, it was initially passed for the IRS to get $80 billion of additional spending. And so $1.36 billion of this, in this deal, the debt limit deal, is going to be rescinded. Only a small portion of that, but then $20 billion additional dollars will be repurposed into a different sector. So that's a really big cut in the IRS funding that was placed last year, and also a really big loss for Democrats. The IRS funding in its initial purpose was, first of all, to repurpose, get new technologies for the IRS, because a lot of their technologies are really antiquated and outdated, and they don't work as well, and also to hire additional agents to make sure that there are no tax cheats and that corporations and millionaires and really rich people aren't are paying their fair share, rather. It also adds money to veterans programs. It extends work benefits for those who are receiving food stamps and healthcare benefits. So basically, if you want to receive food stamps and healthcare benefits, you're going to need to reach an extended minimum requirement of hours you work to receive those benefits. So that's one thing. It approves the West Virginia Natural Gas Pipeline Project, which you can probably guess which senator really focused on this. None other than Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. He really just snuck this into the deal to really bring that home to West Virginians, but not focusing on the long-term impact of climate change and what's that going to mean for there to be another gas pipeline. It's also going to phase out tax credits for electric vehicles and get rid of tax credits for used vehicles entirely. And then also claws back money that was set aside for COVID, but that we haven't spent yet. That didn't seem to be all that polarizing. And then also creates an agency to get energy projects approved more quickly. So those are the main things. If I missed any, comment them down below. There were some things that weren't included in the bill. And again, the idea of compromise was really strong because the Republicans wanted deeper spending cuts and stricter work requirements for those benefits like healthcare and food stamps, but they didn't get those, right? It only went to a certain level. They also wanted to repeal hundreds of billions of dollars in tax incentives that Biden signed to accelerate the transition to lower emission energy sources, but again, that didn't happen. And then Biden and the Democrats really wanted to raise taxes on corporations and high earners and take new steps to reduce Medicare's spending on prescription drugs, but none of those made it into the deal. So again, the idea of compromise. Now that we've gotten the logistics and background of the bill out of the way, what does this actually mean politically wise, right? Because it took a while, as I've said repeatedly, for this deal to get done. The Senate went into an overhaul mode in the last few days last week. They really got this done back then. The Senate has this thing where when they really need to meet a certain deadline, they get it done. It's they procrastinate like the rest of us. And then the very last night that something's due, that's when they really go into work mode and get it done, because they don't want to spend their weekends worrying about this or worrying about the U.S. going into default, because as a lot of like political leaders like even Hakeem Jeffries and Kevin McCarthy, who are on completely different sides, they've repeatedly said, and so has Biden, that defaulting wasn't an option. The U.S. government cannot default. That's simply not an option for them, and so they needed to reach a deal somehow. But over these past couple months, we haven't seen that much progress being made. It's just, we hear in the news that McCarthy is going over to Biden's place and Biden to McCarthy's, and they're having these conversations, but nowhere, these conversations aren't going anywhere. That's what we've been hearing. Even though we did reach compromise as a nation, it was really because we had to, because defaulting would be the worst possible thing. And I think we need to look to the extent that this was going to impact our nation. Defaulting would have been the absolute worst possible thing for America and Americans. The people, the government, the everything. Because our economy, as shown in polling, is probably the number one issue to most people, and politicians alike. And so when you have the economy facing in front of you, and you still can only reach a deal the few nights after it's done, what does that mean for something else? What if we have an issue of lesser importance that's not the economy, which is basically if the most important thing? If you have something of lesser value, what's that going to look like for the Congress? And this is all really vague, but just as an overall idea, what is our Congress going to look like if it takes this long to get something done? It took a while, and still many people didn't vote on it. Senator Bernie Sanders, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Josh Hawley, far left and far right people alike did not vote on this deal because they couldn't compromise. They said, this is not going to work for us because we're not cutting enough spending, or we're cutting too much spending. And so it wasn't doing enough for either of the extremes. But what does that say about those individuals? Are they just sticking to their guns, or are they putting their politics ahead of the people? Because that's something that we also heard from Kevin McCarthy repeated over and over again, that he was putting people over politics. That was his main mission, was to get this done for the American people. But what does that look like? Because if it takes this long to get something this repetitive done, because this is something, the debt limit is increasingly raised it was raised 2 or 3 times under the last administration, something that is raised pretty frequently over the last 50 years or so. And this whole debt ceiling drama shouldn't even been into play to the amount that it was. But the Republicans specifically did take advantage of their upper hand in this situation, having control of the House. But overall, it didn't seem like this was as much of a compromise as people are making it out to seem. And sure, we got the bill in the end, but what was the journey to getting to the bill? How much did Kevin McCarthy and his caucus and the rest of the people in the Congress, Democrats and Republicans alike, put people over politics? That's the question I want you all to think about later. Thank you, and I hope to see you guys next time.